Modern society is very different, of course, from ancient Greek and Roman societies. Like, I look at the two of us, we're talking through a laptop across thousands of miles. You know, if Socrates came back to life and we're looking at this kind of thing, you would be astonished, right? It was like, whoa, what the hell is this thing? Stoicism will tell you, yeah, those people are invading your country. They're still your brothers and sisters. They're simply mistaken about what they're doing. They don't understand that what they're doing is wrong. I think that Russian soldiers, like any soldier, actually, anywhere, does bear moral responsibility for what they do. If they're fighting a war that they realize is not just, then they should quit. They should desert. It would be absurd to say, oh, the Russians are justified in the aggression because. That would be absurd. But it's not absurd to say, what the hell were those people thinking? Even within the United States and within Europe, there was fairly strong disagreement about expanding NATO eastward.
Hello, my name is Mikhail Zygar. Every week I'm speaking to the unique guests, and today I'm going to interview Professor Massimo Pigliucci, a well-known philosopher, writer, and author of series of books about modern Stoicism. Hello, Professor. This year is a very unusual one, and it looks like many of our values and in many ways of how we approach this reality have changed because of that terrible war. Do you think that the Stoicism and that philosophy is still relevant for the people that know that they must do anything they could, and they should have emotions, they should have all those passions that were always criticized by Stoic philosophers?
It's a good question.
Is it a real huge change in our perception of Stoicism?
Right. No, it's a great question, and I think the short answer is yes. I think Stoicism is going to be particularly useful under very difficult circumstances, although it is a general philosophy of life, so it's useful regardless of whether one's circumstances are dire or not. But let me begin by address your implied point, that is that Stoicism tries to suppress emotions. That's what a lot of people think, that, you know, Stoicism is about going through life with a stiff upper lip and you know, suppressing your emotions. But in fact, that is a modern mischaracterization of what Stoic philosophy is about. First of all, it's not possible to suppress emotions. It's just not going to work. Empirically speaking, you simply cannot suppress your emotions. So a philosophy based on the idea that you should do so, it's dead in the water right at the starting point. What the Stoics are trying to do instead is to shift their emotional spectrum in a sense. They're trying to move away from what they consider unhealthy emotions, the kind of emotions that get in the way of living a good life or solving your problems, and then conversely cultivate what they think of as healthy emotions, the kind of emotions that actually are helpful in living your life. So it's not about suppressing emotions as much as it is about essentially coming to terms with your emotions and shifting them in a more productive direction. Now, in practice, what does that mean? Well, one of the emotions that the Stoics thought was unhealthy, and which may be counterintuitive, was anger. And I'm sure that a lot of people that are involved in a war, that are under hardship and you know, living in a really unusual situation, will be angry. It's natural to be angry under those conditions. But the Stoics' response would be that being angry doesn't actually help you. In fact, it gets in the way of you doing things that are right and appropriate. Because the problem is that even when anger is justified, let's say as a result of an injustice, as a result of, a situation that you cannot control and that it's not good, that sort of stuff. Even so, if you act on the basis of anger, you're likely to make mistakes. And the reason for that, according to the Stoics, is that anger is one of those emotions that interfere with good reasoning. So if you act on the basis of anger, you're not reasoning properly. You're not actually thinking straight. And if you don't reason properly, then chances are you're going to make mistakes. Let me give you an example. It's well known, for instance, that in good martial artists try to make their opponent angry. They taunt him. They try to sort of make it so that the opponent is going to respond with anger. Why? Well, because if you respond with anger to a situation, you are less careful. You are you're reacting on the basis of your emotions, not on the basis of good technique, not on the basis of your reasoning. And so you're more likely to lose the game. So I would say that even in an extreme situation like war, although anger is certainly natural and it's certainly humanly understandable, it is not a good reaction because it gets in the way of your proper way of thinking about things. And after all, we are the thinking animals. We are the kind of animals that solves our problems or improves our situations by thinking through stuff. That's what makes human beings different from a lot of other species. So I would say that Stoicism is actually helpful, although it's difficult, of course, to practice. I mean, that's the thing is, we're talking now about a war. I've also been talking about Stoicism a lot during the height of the pandemic, of the COVID pandemic. And people were saying, is Stoicism going to be useful during a pandemic? I say yes, but ideally, you should have started practicing Stoicism before the problem comes in, right? Because otherwise, it's like, again, to use a sports metaphor, it's like, I throw you into the ring with a professional boxer without having given you any lessons on boxing, right? Well, you're going to be pummeled because what are you going to do? I mean, if I just give you last minute instructions on how to do things, you might be able to fend his blows for a little bit, but eventually you're gonna, pretty soon you're gonna fall down because you're not prepared, you're not trained. The issue is that practical philosophy, like Stoicism, is like anything else. It requires mindfulness, it requires training, it requires paying attention to it. If you just pick it up on the whim, it's not very likely to work.
Okay, and Stoicism usually teaches people to not to be overacted, not to be nervous about those things you cannot change. Just you should distinguish what depends on you and what does not depend on you. And I think during those events like war, it's very hard to evaluate. It's very hard to tell one from another. For example, let's speak about Russians for a minute, and then come to Ukrainians. For a person living in Russia, it's very hard to tell if you can change anything, if you can change the regime, or it does not depend on you. Although most of Ukrainians tell Russians you should fight against your government and you should stop the war, but some Russians, most Russian immigrants respond with a very simple answer: we cannot do anything. It doesn't depend on us. All we can do is to flee. And the rest of Russian population say we cannot do anything, so we are just silent. So what's the criteria? How to distinguish one from another?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Stoics are actually very clear about what the criterion is. And the criterion is simple in terms of theory, but very difficult to actually implement in terms of practice. The criterion is this: The only things that are really, truly up to us, according to the Stoics, are our judgments and our decisions to act or not to act. Everything else is not ultimately up to us. That is, the outcomes of our actions are not up to us because they depend on other factors, such as other people, such as external factors, environmental factors, all sorts of stuff. So, for instance, let's start with simple examples, and then we'll go back to wars and regime changes. Let's say, again, to use a metaphor for an athlete, let's say that I'm a soccer player, football player, right, as the rest of the world calls it. So we're in the middle of World Cup. In fact, while we're talking, Brazil and Croatia are playing in the quarterfinals, right? Now, let's say that you are a Croatian player, and what you want to do is to score goals for your side. What you want to do is to win the game. What you want to do is to move on to the semifinals and eventually maybe even win the cup. But all of those things, according to the Stoics, are not up to the player. They depend on a bunch of other things. The player can certainly contribute to that, right? So you can try to score a goal. You can try to to make your contribution to continue to win the game. But ultimately, of course, the outcome depends on your comrades within your own team. If they work well with you, maybe you're going to succeed. If they don't work well, you're not. It depends, of course, on your opponent. The Brazilians, I'm sure, are not going to sit down and just let the Croatians score whenever they want, et cetera, et cetera. So according to if our hypothetical Croatian player were a Stoic, before the game, he would ask himself, okay, what here is up to me and what is not up to me? And he will realize that the only thing that is really up to him is the moment-by-moment decisions that he's going to make. Nobody else can make those decisions for him, right? People can tell him, maybe the coach or his comrades can tell him, you should pass the ball here, or you should try to do this or that or the other. But ultimately, the buck stops with him. He is the one that is in charge of his own decisions. There's nobody else can actually do it for him. However, as a good Stoic, he would also recognize that the outcome of those decisions is not up to him, and therefore that he has to accept mentally, in his mind, even before he starts doing anything, he has to accept that all he can do is to work toward the desired outcome, but he cannot control that desired outcome. Right? Mm-hmm. So, for instance, he can decide right here, right now, we're in the middle of the game. I decide that I want to throw the ball toward my companion to the left. That's my decision based on my assessment of what's happening on the field right now. Right? I see that my comrade on the left is free, the one on the right is not. So I make the decision to throw the ball in that direction. That's up to me. Whether the ball actually reaches my companion is not up to me. He could be distracted. It might not have seen the fact that I was passing the ball. There may be a defensive player on the other side that intercepts the ball. All sorts of things could happen that I have no control over. So the Stoic notion is that the best thing that you can do is to focus on making the right decisions, or the best kind of decisions you can make, and then initiate the actions that stem from those decisions. But then at the same time, you have to prepare yourself mentally to accept whatever outcome comes, because the outcomes are not up to you. Even unfavorable outcomes, even unjust outcomes are not up to you. Now, let's scale back this up to war and regime change. So if I am living in a country where there is a regime that starts a war that I disagree with, et cetera, what am I supposed to do? Clearly, changing regime is not up to me. The people you're talking about are absolutely right. It's not in their power to change regime. That's an outcome. It's not up to them. What is up to them, however, is to do whatever may help going things in the right direction. Now, sometimes what helps is, in fact, leave the country. That is certainly one option. Deciding to leave the country is essentially a pretty clear vote of no confidence toward the regime. People don't leave their country for no reason. They don't leave their country because their life is great and everything is fine. They leave their country as a last resort, usually as a show of, as a result of desperation. But it's also a vote of no confidence toward that country. It basically saying loud and clear, look, I rather abandon everything that I own. I rather abandon my friends and part of my family and get the hell out of here because this is not a good place. That's a fairly strong statement. So sometimes the best thing you can do is simply that, to make clear that people know that, I'm leaving because this is not a great place. Now, some other people might be able to do more. I mean, after all, within Russia, there are dissident organizations. There are people that voice their opinion against the regime. Yeah, they risk, of course, right? There's a heightened risk. It's more risky to stay and speak up than to leave. But nevertheless, it can be done. And there is an interesting passage in one of the Stoic writers, Epictetus, where he talks about something like that. He's talking about two slaves, both of whom are asked by their master to hold the chamber pot. So basically, it's a very humiliating thing that, nobody wants to do it. Now, one slave decides that, you know what, I'm going to do it because the alternative is I'm going to be beaten up or possibly even killed, and I just don't think it's that important. I'm going to do it. The other slave says, no, I am a human being. I have my own dignity, even though I'm a slave. I will not do it, and I'll face the consequences. Now, interestingly, Epictetus doesn't make any judgments about the two slaves. He doesn't say one is better than the other, or you should do this versus you should do that. He's just saying those two were in front of the same situation, and they decided to act differently. And their decision need to be respected because that's the best that they could do according to their own light. So there are different ways of reacting to difficult situations. Some of us are willing to take more risks and some of us are not. But whatever you do is always going to be the result of your own decisions. And so what you want to make sure is that you thought very carefully about your decisions before moving into action. Is this the right thing to do? Is this the best thing that I can do? Right? Don't cut yourself too much slack and say, oh, nothing is ever going to change, therefore I'm not going to do anything. That's too easy. It's much more honest to say, well, I probably could stay and fight, but I don't have it in me. I'm concerned with my family. I'm concerned with, my kids or whatever it is. So I decide to leave. That's perfectly fine. That's an honest answer. Nobody's going to criticize you for doing that. But if we start making excuses and say, oh, nothing's ever going to change, that's just not true. Regimes do change. They do fall. And usually that happens because of internal and external pressures acting simultaneously.
Thank you. I hope you will correct me if I'm wrong, but it always seemed to me that Stoicism is some kind of very modern philosophy. In terms of it corresponds a lot to the way of life and way of thinking that is very popular among the people of 21st century. It fits the mindset of the 21st century person because it focuses on the person, on the individual, in the personal choices, personal behavior, and according to that mindset, some values, like for example sacrifice, seem to be, if not outdated, but very very strange. And in terms of Stoicism, how would you comment on the new reality where people have unexpectedly have to choose, and their first choice is to sacrifice their lives for the sake of their country. Like for many years, we have now those people living in Ukraine could never think of that. Like they were living their normal, contemporary, modern 21st century life as any European, any American, any Russian, and now they unexpectedly are facing the alternatives. People usually have to face centuries ago.
Right. No, you're absolutely right. However, again, that seems to me an advantage of Stoicism rather than a limitation. I mean, the fact is, sure, Stoicism is a philosophy that started out like 2,400 years ago, right? 24 centuries ago. And so it's perfectly fair to ask, well, yeah, but what does have had to do with a situation in the 21st century? But you could be asking the same question about other philosophies or religions, right? You could be asking the same question about Christianity, which also started 2,000 years ago.
No. On the contrary, I think that unlike Christianity, Stoicism fits a lot.
Well, I would agree with you. But I'm saying it's a fair question to ask yourself. Well, does it fit? Is it possible that something that was started 2,000 years ago or whatever fits? And I think you're right. It does fit. Now, it fits. Why? First of all, because the situations that people find themselves in are not really that different now that they have been for the past several centuries or even millennia. Think about it this way. Sure, modern society is very different, of course, from ancient Greek and Roman societies. Like I look at the two of us, we're talking through a laptop across thousands of miles. If Socrates came back to life and we're looking at this kind of thing, you would be astonished, right? It was like, whoa, what the hell is this thing? However, then if Socrates were to sit down next to us and then join the conversation, the initial shock of the technology and the way things work would then be followed by, oh, these people are talking about stuff that is familiar to me. They're talking about war. They're talking about displacement. They're talking about human suffering. They're talking about what to do or not to do under certain conditions. That's exactly what was going on when Socrates was alive. There was a war then as well, the Peloponnesian War, which was one of the largest wars to engulf the Mediterranean, 2.5 millennia ago, fought between Sparta and Athens and their allies, was actually a war. And there was not only there was a war, there was a pestilence there. They had something like COVID also to deal with at the same time, right? I mean, Socrates survived the plague in Athens, but a lot of his friends died during that period. So situations are not very different because human beings are not very different. Our technology and science certainly are different, and therefore we're far more lethal, for instance, today in terms of war technology than the ancient Greeks and Romans could possibly imagine. But we're still doing the same stuff. We're still fighting against each other. We're still trying to survive. We're still trying to protect our families, etc. Now, you mentioned correctly that Stoicism is a personal philosophy. And so, the answer always begins with you. It's like, what can I do at an individual level? That is true. But it's not that the Stoics don't have broader ideas about how we should organize society. So it's not just about the individual. Yes, the individual is crucial because, after all, who makes decisions in life? Individuals, right? All decisions in human life are made by individuals. Of course, some individuals are much more powerful than others, and therefore their decisions are much more consequential than others. But it always comes down to individual decisions. Somebody, a human being, decides to get into war, to get his country into war or not. It's always a human being making decisions. However, the Stoics also had this broader view of where we should go in the long run. And where we should go is something that they refer to as cosmopolitanism, right? This notion that we should actually remember that at a fundamental level, we're all the same. Despite differences of culture, differences of gender, differences of whatever you want, we're all human beings, and we're all made in the same way. We all have the same fears and joys and wants and needs, et cetera, and therefore that what we want to do is always to treat others, regardless of who they are, as if they were our brothers and sisters. Now, imagine if we actually implemented that kind of view, then we wouldn't have wars, right? But in the meantime, it's going to be really difficult to think of somebody who is invading your country as a brother or sister, right? It's really counterintuitive. But I think that is one of the strengths of Stoicism. Stoicism will tell you, yeah, those people are invading your country. They're still your brothers and sisters. They're simply mistaken about what they're doing. They don't understand that what they're doing is wrong. And therefore, yes, of course, you have a right to defend yourself. Absolutely. That comes first. You have a right to defend your family. You have a right to defend your friends and your country. But at the same time, you want to do it in a way that reminds you of the fact that this has always happened. Sometimes your people are going to be on the receiving side. In other occasions, your people are going to be on the offending side. We're all essentially always human beings. We all make mistakes. We all do things that are indefensible and unreasonable. And just we need to understand that. And that understanding brings both inner peace as well as forgiveness for others, at least in the long run.
I think that that usually Stoicism is associated for many people with patience. And do you can you confirm if patience is a real virtue, and does it justify that? For example, Stoicism advises person to be patient in face of dictatorship, for example, and does it justify conformity and submission to the authoritarian regime?
Right, that's a good question. There's a distinction, I think, between patience and passivity, right? So being passive means you're just going to take it. You're going to lay back and say, I'm not going to do anything. That's not being patient. That's just being passive. Patience means that you don't act necessarily in the moment because you realize that acting in the moment would actually not be the right course of action, right? So a patient chess player or a patient martial artist is the one that waits until the best moment to make the move, and then it strikes, right? So it's not somebody who never strikes. It's not somebody who just sits back and says, I'm not going to do anything. There's a big difference. And the Stoics certainly do not advise passivity. They do advise patience, meaning that, again, that's why there's for the Stoics, emotions like anger are so problematic, because anger undermines your patience. People that are angry are not patient. They tend to act immediately. And the Stoics would say, well, yeah, you might want to act immediately, but on the other hand, this may not be the best time to act, or this may not be the best way to act. And so you're going to undermine your own long-term chances of success. So patience just means that you're using your mind, you're using reason to evaluate the situation and arrive again at a judgment, the best judgment possible. That's the only thing that is up to you, remember. And the best judgment, sometimes it is, I need to act now. I mean, it's not like the Stoics always wait for something. It depends. It depends on the situation. Sometimes the best judgment really is to act now, because now is the moment. Now it's a favorable set of opportunity, and you need to act. But at other times, reason will say, hold on. If you act now, you're probably going to have a disaster. You're probably not going to succeed. So sit back and be patient. But be patient, again, is not the same thing as being passive.
In the beginning, we were discussing healthy and unhealthy emotions and passions. So, what about revenge? Is that phenomena that was the most important topic of the world's literature for centuries, and now seem to be some kind of ancient phenomena, because even for the 20th century, with the concept of human rights, and it's not really relevant, and it doesn't seem to be relevant for Stoicism as well. What can you tell me about revenge?
Yeah, that's another good question. So revenge is actually something that the Stoics do write extensively about, because it's often connected with hatred and anger. Anger often turns into hatred, and hatred then spurs people towards seeking revenge. So the Stoics would say that revenge is an unhealthy thing to pursue. What we need to pursue is justice, and there is a difference between justice and revenge. So the classic story that the Stoics use is the story of Medea. So Medea was a non-Greek princess who helps the Jason and the Argonauts find get a hold of the golden fleece. But then what happens? So she has two children with Jason, and then Jason promises that as soon as they're back to Greece, they're going to get married. What happens? They go back to Greece, and of course, immediately Jason changes his mind. He says, you're a barbarian. I really can't marry a barbarian. I need to marry a Greek princess. Medea rightly gets upset, right? This is an injustice. Jason is betraying Medea's trust. So up to this point, the fact that Medea reacts negatively to the news is perfectly acceptable, because her trust has been violated. However, what does she do? She seeks revenge, and the first act of revenge that she does is killing her own children in order to spite Jason. Now that's of course awful, right? That's horrible.
Yeah, and that's a bit unfair example.
Yeah, it's obviously it's a mythological example, so it's obviously
Let me give you another example. A lot of people in the world, and for sure in Ukraine, want to see Putin dead, and many people want to see Russian soldiers. Like all of them want to see Russian soldiers dead, and not only soldiers. Like many Ukrainians want to see Russians dead. Is it justice? Or is it a revenge?
I don't think so. I think it's revenge. And in fact, it's kind of interesting you bring up that example, because to me, that actually has a parallel with the Medea example. Why does Medea...
If we talk about Putin, is it the same?
If we're talking about Russian soldiers and Russians in general, right? So that's clearly an overstepping of one's emotional response. It's just like Medea. Why does Medea kill her own children? Because she can't reason anymore. She's so angry. She's so driven by hatred that those emotions take over her reason, and she doesn't understand until it's too late that she's actually killing innocent people. Now, justice means bringing the people responsible for the war in front of an international tribunal, and then accept what the international tribunal does. Now, as you know, the international tribunal does not actually contemplate the death penalty. So we wouldn't be talking about death penalty. Now, we could have a separate discussion about whether the death penalty is a good idea or not. The Stoics thought it was, most of the Stoics. Seneca says at some point, killing somebody is an act of mercy because he's so bad for his own character that it's just like, you're actually doing him a favor. Another Stoic, Epictetus, on the other hand, argued against the death penalty. So there's a discussion to be had there. But I think that justice would be what we've done or we have tried to do with other wars in the past. You apprehend the people who are responsible, you charge them in front of an international tribunal, and then they'll accept the consequences. But we do not go after every single soldier, their families, their friends, and so on and so forth, because we realize that those people, by and large, were following orders. Most of them are not actually primarily responsible for what's going on. If the role had been exchanged, shifted around, I'm sure a lot of Ukrainians would have done the same exact thing because they were ordered to do those kind of things. It's really difficult to be a professional soldier and not do what you're being told, because you're going to be shot as a result of that as a traitor. So even though I think that Russian soldiers, like any soldier actually anywhere, does bear moral responsibility for what they do. If they're fighting a war that they realize is not just, then they should quit. They should desert. right? So they do have some responsibility, but that responsibility is far, far lower than the responsibility of the people who actually decided to start the war and gave the orders. And certainly the friends and family of those soldiers do not have much, if any, of a responsibility. So that's the thing. If you act reasonably, if you look for justice, then what you're going to do is you're going to go after the big fish, and then you're going to be as forgiving as possible toward the little fish. But if you allow yourself to act on the basis of anger and hatred, then you're going to go after everybody. You're not going to be happy until everybody's been exterminated. That's not a humane response.
You know, it's interesting how your explanation reminded me of the recent scandal. I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but I'll tell you the plot. Recently, one oppositional Russian TV channel that previously worked in Russia but had to leave Russia and was working in Latvia, Riga, since July. Was blamed for being still pro-Russian and pro-Putin because one of the anchors said on air that he feels sorry for Russian soldiers who suffer while fighting during this war, and there was a huge scandal and a huge debate whether it's right thing to do and whether it's possible to feel sorry for Russian soldiers at the same time as you think that the obvious victim in this war is Ukraine, and you want Ukrainian side to be victorious.
No, that's a very interesting example. From a Stoic perspective, that commentator was right. We should be pitying the Russian soldiers. Most of them probably don't want to be there. A lot of them are going to have been killed already. I mean, at least here in the West, we keep hearing fairly large statistics in terms of casualties, of course, on both sides. So they do need to be pitied. Now, that said, it makes a difference how exactly that Russian soldier is behaving. If a soldier, Russian or not, it doesn't matter. But if a soldier engages in acts of war and essentially defending his country or going on the offensive, but sticks to what a soldier is supposed to do, which is killing enemies, then they are certainly morally responsible, but they're not really blameworthy for much. If, on the other hand, they step outside of the boundaries of what some refer to as a just war action way of acting. For instance, they start targeting civilians, or they start engaging in rape and massacres or stuff like that. Then they're individually responsible. Then that's a situation where your sympathy is going to be misplaced because now those people have actually crossed a boundary. So I think that, broadly speaking, from the little that you said, that commentator was right, that it is a good thing to remind ourselves that on the other side, we're still fighting human beings, and those human beings are dying, are suffering, and probably don't want to be there. That, I think, is a good exercise. It's a good mental exercise, because it's too easy for us to demonize the opponent, the enemy, right? To treat them as if they were animals, as if they were cockroaches. They're not. They're human beings. They're mistaken human beings. They're human beings that are making mistakes, and they're certainly human beings that unfortunately are currently being very dangerous, and so we need to defend ourselves from them. But that's not to say that we should not have empathy for what they're going through. The two are definitely not mutually exclusive. This reminds me actually of a similar episode that happened in the United States, a famous episode shortly after the 2001 attacks, the September 2001 attacks, right? So if you, as I'm sure everybody remembers, there's these people, terrorists driving airplanes into the Twin Towers. One of the chief American comedians and commentators, Bill Maher, on his show, which was airing on primetime on, I think it was ABC television, at some point said, I don't understand all these people that say that the terrorists were cowards. It's like, you cannot be a coward and actually decide to drive a plane with yourself into a skyscraper. That takes courage. It's not a cowardly action. Now, it's a terrorist action. It's a horrible thing to do, but nevertheless, it's not cowardly. He was trying to make a distinction that I think is perfectly valid. It's not, just because you're saying that those people are not cowards, it doesn't mean you're saying they did anything right, or you're not condoning what they're doing. You're simply stating fact. And of course, as a result, Bill Maher immediately, the show got canceled and he lost his job. He's doing fine now because he got into another channel. He has his own new show now for a number of years. But that was a similar situation where he was simply saying something that is pretty obvious. Of course, it takes guts to do that kind of thing, but equally true, of course, it's not the right thing to do. So the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive at all.
You know, I'm listening to you, and I'm feeling a bit nervous, probably, because I know that what we're discussing right now might offend some of our viewers from Ukraine, and I understand their feelings. At the same time, I know that according to Stoics, sometimes it's not needed to care. You should not care about other people's emotions. You should focus on your own emotions, and you cannot change other people's perception and other people's emotions. And I think that there is a problem in today's world, because in our reality, other people's emotions are very important, and like everyday life and the reality of the 21st century teaches us to be extremely careful about other people's emotions, and all the new ethical codes, all the diversity rules, like all the Western culture proves that it's super important. So has it changed this perception, that classical Stoicism perception?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point you bring up. So first of all, I would like to be on record as saying that, yeah, I do support the Ukrainian people, literally, meaning that since the beginning of the war, I've been actually giving money on a regular basis to an organization, American organization called the International Rescue Committee, which is in charge of refugee camps in Poland and surrounding areas. So yeah, I'm definitely on that side. This is not a difficult decision for me. When I decided that I needed to do something, the thing that I decided to do was to support the Ukrainian people, because they are the ones that have been under aggression. That said, you're absolutely right. I'm sure that some of your listeners in Ukraine are going to be offended by what we were saying, or what I said. It's not that I don't care per se. I mean, I don't go out of my way to offend people. It's not like, offending people is a way to create a barrier with other people. And I don't want barrier. I'd rather have a conversation with other people. So I'm always concerned when other people get offended. But at the same time, you're right. The Stoics remind me that, other people's opinions are not up to me. It's only my opinions that are up to me. And here we're having a conversation. I should be free to telling you what I think, and you should be free, of course, to challenge what I say, and vice versa. The same goes for your listeners, right? So the point of these kinds of conversations is to be exposed to different ideas and then to evaluate them on your own. So the problem with being offended is that once you say, I'm offended by what you say, this is the end of the conversation. It's a stopping. It's stop, as opposed to say, I disagree with what you're saying, right? So if you disagree with somebody without being offended, then there is a conversation, there is a dialogue, because then the next question I'm going to ask is, well, okay, fair enough, you disagree. On what? On what grounds? Why do you think? It's possible that I'm wrong about what I just said. So please tell me why you disagree, and then we can have a conversation. But if you're saying, I'm offended, that's usually a conversation stopper. That's the end of the dialogue. There is no moving forward, because the only thing I can say at that point is either I'm sorry or I don't care. But either way, it's not gonna actually make the dialogue go forth. So I think that you mentioned the fact that some areas of the Western world, some cultures within the Western world recently have been playing a little too much on the notion of offense. And I think that's right. Again, people get offended these days for all sorts of things, some of which really shouldn't be offensive. And the Stoics have this notion about offense. Epictetus talks about it quite a bit. He says, look, if somebody offends you, all that is happening is another person opening their mouth and putting out some air. Air isn't going to hurt you. There's no hurt that comes to you. The hurt is in your mind. If you are hurt by somebody, if you're offended by somebody, it's because you let that happening, not the other person. The other person is just uttering words, and words don't do anything. Words are not bullets. Words are not swords. They're not tanks. They're not bombs. They cannot hurt you. The only time they hurt you is because you yourself allow them to hurt you. And guess what? That's up to you. You can look at somebody who says something offensive and you can say, sorry, I'm not going to go there. I disagree, and that's the end of the story. I don't need to feel offensive. Offense, in a sense, is a self-indulgent emotion. It's like, oh, poor me, I've been offended. Like, okay, so now what? What are you going to do with that? And unfortunately, some people, this is not as widespread, I think, as it has been portrayed in the media, but it does happen. Some people use their offense as a way to shut down discourse for others. Right? So, oh, you're offending me, so you're not going to be allowed to talk because you're offensive. It's like, well, no. Sorry, that's a problem. You have the right to be offended, and if you're offended, so for instance, I'm sure you've heard that there's been a number of situations on American university campuses where a controversial speaker was invited by a student group or by the university administration, and then some students thought, no, what this person is saying is offensive, so we're not allowing him to speak. That, I think, is not the proper response. The proper response is, this person is offensive, so I'm not going to go listen to him, right? So I'm going to boycott the event. I will, he will be by himself and with a few people, and we're not going to go. Or the even better response is, okay, this person is coming to campus and he's going to say something that I find offensive and I disagree with, so let me organize another parallel event where I'm going to have another speaker who's going to explain why this first person is incorrect, offensive, et cetera, et cetera. That is the way to do it. But just say, no, you're not allowed to speak because you're offending me. Well, it's a slippery slope.
Okay.
Right? We can all get offended about all sorts of things. And then now pretty soon, nobody's going to talk.
Okay. And what about hate speech? Is it something special? Or is it within the same rule?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, so in the United States, some parties, especially on the right side and libertarian side of the political spectrum, would argue that free speech is absolute, right? That there should be no limitations at all. But that has never been the case. Not even the American Constitution is very permissive. In that respect, that is, the Constitution protects free speech to a very large extent, but even that is not absolute. I mean, the obvious example that I'm sure you've heard before is if we are in a theater and I start yelling that there is a fire while in fact there is no fire. That speech is not protected. I'm going to go to jail because I'm going to cause, as a result of that yelling fire when there is no actual danger, I might cause a stampede, people might get hurt, et cetera, et cetera. So it's simply not true that speech in general is absolutely protected. It's that, or should it be? Where you draw the line, it's an interesting conversation. For me, but this is my personal opinion, the line is at incentivizing violence. So I don't have a problem with offensive speech, even when it is against racist speech or things like that, so long as there is no direct incitement to violence. Let me give you an example. For many years, I've given money to the American Civil Liberties Union, which is about protection of free speech, right? And then I realized that the ACLU has defended the Ku Klux Klan in court proceedings. Like, these are the people with the white, cap who was clearly racist, who in the past have been, responsible for killing black people, etc. It's like, wait a minute, what do you mean you're defending the Ku Klux Klan? And how does that come about? And I looked into it, and the reasoning that the ACLU uses, I think, is correct. He says, look, if a member of the KKK tells a crowd, go out there, pick up people and hang them, that's clearly incitement to violence, and that is not protected. There's no way at all. But if the KKK person simply says, I think my race is better than your race, well, that's stupid. That is false, because there's no such thing as human races. That is offensive, but it's his opinion.
Yeah, I've got a problem with that perception, because
many people
because 10 years of such hate speech on Russian television, 10 years of such imperialist propaganda have led us to this war, although they were not speaking about the war and the violence all the time. They were just preparing the population for that.
Sure, but think about the opposite example. So if we start saying like offensive speech or hate speech should be prohibited, then it depends on, you might get yourself in situations where somebody claims that something is hate speech while in fact arguably it isn't. For instance, I have spent
as Russian authorities do, like any criticism towards Putin is equalized to the hate speech or extremism even.
Correct. So, for instance, let me give a specific example that concerned my experience. So, I was for 9 years during my career as an academic. I was teaching at the University of Tennessee, which is in the south of the United States. Now, I was there teaching as an evolutionary biologist, and it was also very clear that I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. When people ask me, I would say, yeah, sure, I don't go to church. But that area of the South is mostly, most of the people there are Christians, fundamentalist Christians, very, very strong version of Christianity, and they're creationists. That is, they reject the notion of evolution. So I was told more than once by people, including some of my neighbors in Knoxville, that the fact that I was an evolutionary biologist and an atheist was offensive to them. That my talking about atheism and evolution was essentially an attack on Christianity and therefore counted as hate speech. You see how the slippery slope is easy to get on, right? Because wait a minute, what do you mean? That's clearly not hate speech. I'm not inciting anybody to violence. But some people, and in that region of the country, that was the majority of the people. This is not just a few nutcases. This is the majority of the people thought that simply talking about atheism or about evolution constituted hate speech. So I'm always more than a little concerned when people use the word hate speech, because it's now become so widespread that it's used for anything you don't like. And it's like, well, no, hold on. It's the bar should be a little higher, basically. That's why I think that incitement to violence is actually, on the other hand, a much more clear line. Now, does that mean that if we put the bar that high at incitement for violence, we allow some actual hate speech to go around? Yeah, it does. And there is no perfect solution to this issue. It's a question of how much you want to curtail people's speech versus how much you want to safeguard people's freedom. Let me add one more thing about this notion of free speech, because a lot of Americans seem not to understand what that is it's actually about. in the United States, many people will tell you free speech is regulated, is defended by the Constitution, right? Which is true, but the Constitution refers only to speech that is impeded by the government, not by anyone outside of government. So, for instance, if you are doing a podcast, right, and I say something on your podcast that you think it's hateful or not, or over the top or something, and you delete it, right? It's not that I can complain that my free speech is being
or when Twitter blocks Donald Trump's account.
Yes, that's right. That's not a violation of free speech because Twitter is not the government. Twitter is a private company. They can do whatever the hell they want with their own platform. It's like having, if I invite you in my home and I don't like you, I'm going to throw you out. And it's not, you can't complain and say, oh, well, but this was, I was invited. Yeah, and I didn't like you. It's my home, so I throw you out. Now, on the other hand, if you go to a restaurant, which is a public establishment, they can't throw you out because they don't like you, because that is discrimination. That is actually protected. So this notion of free speech, we need to be careful because too often people take free speech, the protection of free speech to be universal and unqualified. And it's not. It's neither universal nor unqualified. It couldn't be. It couldn't be. You don't want to live. We wouldn't want to live in a society where everybody can say whatever the hell they want, regardless of the occasion and regardless of the platform. That's a recipe for chaos, not a recipe for an open democratic society.
And probably with my final question, I'd like to return to this Stoicism and ask you if it's possible at all to remain a good person during the war. Do you have to choose? Do you have to fight with that side that seems to be the righteous one? Can you? Is it a crime to remain neutral? Is it how should you behave when you see people killing each other? When you see that actually there is blood from both sides?
Yeah. Oh, that's an excellent question.
I'm speaking more theoretically than about the current conflict.
Yeah, sure. No, it's a good question. I don't think that people should give themselves the luxury to remain neutral. To be involved in a society, to be an active member of society, means that you need to formulate your opinions about what's going on in the world and contribute your opinion to the general discussion. So be neutral and say, it doesn't concern me, or I'm outside. I think that's a poor choice of behavior. Now, that said, sometimes it's going to be, in fact, a lot of the times, I think, it's going to be very difficult to formulate the right opinion because things are complicated. Like, again, let's go back to the current conflict. So in my mind, there is no question that Russia is the aggressor in this case, and therefore my sympathies should be with Ukraine in the immediate conflict. But if you broaden up things and you start taking into consideration, the history of Russia and NATO interactions, the fact that NATO, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, started expanding.
It's still eastward. And it's still the same.
Right. Yeah. So that one is like,
it doesn't change anything.
It changes in this sense. It changes in this sense. It doesn't make things equal. It's certainly, it would be absurd to say, oh, the Russians are justified in the aggression because that would be absurd. But it's not absurd to say, what the hell were those people thinking? Even within the United States and within Europe, there was fairly strong disagreement about expanding NATO eastward at the time. And why was there? Precisely because people were concerned about how Russia would react in the long term. So on the one hand, that's not a justification for aggression. But at the same time, it's a little naive to say, oh, well, these things don't happen for a reason. They just, it's just the bad guys against the good guys. It's almost never the bad guys against the good guys. So we need to take sides. I think we need to arrive at reasonable judgments. We need especially to help people who need help. That's the most important thing. But at the same time, we also need to take a broader perspective and realize that, aggression has been a kind of a general thing about humanity. Unfortunately, we are a fairly aggressive species, and we make decisions that sometimes we're going to regret 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And we should be aware of it. Again, that does not justify aggression. It does not justify killing people. It does not justify, bombing cities. That's something that is simply out of the question, and there's no justification there. But there are historical and cultural reasons that do need to be taken into account if we want to move forward. If we just want to say, okay, those are the bad guys, therefore we need to kill them all, well, good luck with that. You're not going to be able to do that. If you want to move forward, you have to acknowledge that things are more complicated than that.
Okay, thank you so much. That was an amazing conversation.
Thank you for having me. It was fun.
Thank you. Yeah. Bye-bye.